Billionaire laughs at Waitress in Japanese. Her calm reply silences him instantly. The people who look invisible are usually the ones carrying the heaviest stories. Rain slid slowly down the glass walls of Whitmore Steakhouse like silver lines melting through the Manhattan skyline. Outside, black SUVs rolled through wet streets glowing with neon reflections. While inside, the restaurant breathed in low jazz, crystal glasses, and quiet money. Ethan Whitmore sat alone near the back window in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. A Swiss watch rested against his wrist beneath the cuff of his coat, catching the amber light every time he moved his hand toward the untouched glass of bourbon in front of him. He had just walked out of a disastrous meeting with investors from Tokyo less than an hour earlier, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt something dangerously close to failure. The deal had stalled. The room had turned cold. And somewhere between the legal translations and cultural misunderstandings, he had lost control of the conversation. That was the part he hated most. Ethan Whitmore was a man who controlled rooms, controlled people, controlled outcomes. But tonight, Manhattan felt heavier than usual. The hostess approached carefully before guiding a waitress toward his table. "Claire will be taking care of you tonight, Mr. Whitmore." Ethan barely looked up. "Water. No ice." His voice carried the kind of exhaustion rich men often mistook for authority. "Of course," Claire replied softly. Her voice was calm, almost weightless. Ethan finally glanced at her for less than a second. Blonde hair tied neatly behind her head. Simple black uniform. No jewelry except a thin silver bracelet near her wrist. Ordinary. Completely ordinary. At least that was what he assumed. Claire returned a minute later with the water glass placed carefully beside his bourbon. No noise. No interruption. Just precision. Ethan's business associate Marcus arrived moments later, shaking rain from his coat before dropping into the leather seat across from him. "You look terrible," Marcus said with a grin. "Tokyo didn't go well?" Ethan exhaled sharply and loosened his tie. "They questioned everything. Structure. Timing. Even my translators." Marcus laughed quietly. "You hate when people make you repeat yourself." Ethan leaned back, eyes drifting toward the rain beyond the glass. "The problem with international deals is everybody pretends they understand each other." Claire appeared again beside the table, gently refilling their water. Ethan didn't acknowledge her presence. To him, she blended into the restaurant the same way the piano music did. Background. Invisible. Marcus opened the menu. "You still speaking Japanese?" Ethan smirked faintly. Better than most Americans pretending they do business overseas. Then, without warning, he switched languages mid-sentence, speaking in fluent Japanese under his breath with the kind of confidence that came from believing nobody nearby could understand him. Marcus chuckled immediately. Ethan continued in Japanese, making a dry remark about how American restaurants train servers to smile before they train them to think. Marcus nearly spit out his drink laughing. Claire stood beside the table, completely still, her expression unchanged as she placed fresh bread between them. Ethan never looked at her, never noticed the tiny pause in her hand, never noticed the silence that followed after his words landed. Outside, thunder rolled softly above Manhattan. Inside, Claire adjusted the edge of a linen napkin with calm fingers before quietly asking, "Would you prefer the ribeye medium rare tonight, Mr. Whitmore?" Ethan answered without lifting his eyes from the menu. "Medium." Claire nodded once. "Of course." Then she turned to leave. But just before she walked away, she stopped beside his chair for half a second longer than necessary. And in perfect Japanese, spoken gently enough that only Ethan could hear it, she said, "In Kyoto, my father used to say intelligence sounds loudest when it's trying too hard to impress people." Ethan's hand froze around the bourbon glass. The ice shifted once inside the crystal. Slowly, for the first time that night, he looked directly at her. The sound of rain faded behind the silence at the table. Ethan Whitmore stared at Claire as if the entire restaurant had suddenly shifted out of focus except for her. She stood there calmly beside him, one hand resting lightly against the leather order book tucked near her waist, her expression unchanged. No smugness, No challenge. Just composure. Marcus blinked between them. Wait, he said slowly, pointing toward Claire. You speak Japanese? Claire gave a polite nod. A little. Ethan almost laughed at the understatement, but the sound never fully came out. The sentence she had spoken was not tourist Japanese. It was refined, measured, the kind learned through years, not language apps and business flights. Ethan leaned back carefully in his chair. Where did you learn that accent? Claire adjusted the water glass beside Marcus without rushing. Kyoto. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. You lived there. For several years. Her answer was short, clean. She offered nothing extra. That bothered him more than it should have. Most people around Ethan filled silence with nervous explanations. Claire seemed perfectly comfortable letting silence breathe. Marcus let out a low whistle. That explains why she just humbled you in 2 languages. Claire ignored the joke gently. Are you ready to order? Ethan looked at her for another second before finally opening the menu again. Ribeye. Medium. Mashed potatoes or grilled asparagus? Asparagus. And for your guest? Marcus smiled. I will trust your recommendation. Claire nodded once. The filet tonight is excellent. Then I will take that. She collected the menus gracefully and walked toward the kitchen, her pace steady beneath the soft golden lights hanging above the dining room. Ethan watched her longer than necessary. Marcus noticed immediately. You are thinking about it. Thinking about what? The fact that a waitress just corrected your Japanese like a university professor. Ethan picked up his bourbon slowly. It was one pronunciation mistake. No, Marcus said with a grin. It was your ego getting audited. Ethan smirked faintly despite himself, but his eyes drifted toward the kitchen entrance again. Something about Claire unsettled him in a way he could not explain. Not because she spoke Japanese. Manhattan was full of educated people, wealthy people, impressive people. But Claire carried herself differently. There was no performance in her. No attempt to impress anyone in the room. Even after embarrassing him quietly, she moved through the restaurant exactly the same way she had before. Calm, precise, invisible if she wanted to be. Across the dining room, a wealthy couple argued softly over wine, while a businessman laughed too loudly near the bar. Crystal glasses clinked beneath low jazz piano drifting through hidden speakers. Yet Ethan found himself noticing only small details now. The way Claire folded napkins perfectly square. The way she greeted older guests with genuine warmth instead of rehearsed politeness. The way she bowed her head ever so slightly when thanking customers, almost instinctively. Kyoto, he thought again. A few minutes later Claire returned carrying their plates. Steam rose softly from the ribeye beneath the scent of rosemary butter and charred asparagus. She placed Ethan's dish in front of him with careful hands. Be careful. The plate is very hot. Her voice remained calm enough to cool the entire table. Ethan glanced up at her. Your father was Japanese? Claire shook her head once. No, then why Kyoto? For the first time all evening, Claire hesitated slightly. Just enough for Ethan to notice. My father taught literature there. Ethan expected more. She offered none. Marcus cut into his steak. You know what is funny? He said. You spend half your life flying around the world trying to impress powerful people. Meanwhile, the most interesting person in this restaurant is carrying bread baskets. Claire almost smiled at that, but it disappeared before it fully formed. Ethan noticed something else then. Near her wrist, beneath the restaurant lights, the thin silver bracelet she wore had tiny engraved Japanese characters along the inside edge. Old characters. Delicate ones. Not decorative. Meaningful. Claire caught him looking at it and gently pulled her sleeve down over the bracelet without a word. Then she reached for the empty bourbon glass near his hand. Would you like another? Ethan held her gaze for half a second longer than before. Yes, he said quietly. Please. Claire disappeared briefly behind the swinging kitchen doors while Ethan sat motionless beside the rain-streaked window, staring at the reflection of his own face in the dark glass. For years, people had reacted to him the same way the city reacted to storms. They adjusted themselves around him. They rushed to impress him. They listened harder when he spoke. But Claire Bennett had done something unfamiliar. She had not tried to win his attention. She had simply corrected him and moved on with her evening as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Marcus cut into his steak again and pointed his fork toward Ethan. "You are doing it again." Ethan looked over. "Doing what?" "Thinking too much." Ethan took a slow sip of bourbon. "I am trying to figure her out." Marcus laughed quietly. "Maybe that is the problem. Men like you always think every person in a room is a puzzle to solve." Ethan ignored the comment, but his eyes drifted back toward the kitchen entrance anyway. A few moments later Claire returned carrying a polished silver tea set for another table near the center of the restaurant. The older couple seated there smiled warmly as she poured tea with elegant precision. Ethan noticed the tiny details again. The angle of her wrist. The careful way she turned the porcelain cup before setting it down. Nothing rushed. Nothing careless. It reminded him less of restaurant service and more of ceremony. Claire sensed his eyes on her before she looked over. Their gazes met for only a second. Then she calmly continued working. That unsettled him even more. Most people either challenged powerful men or feared them. Claire did neither. She simply remained herself. Marcus leaned closer. "You know what this really is?" Ethan exhaled softly. "What?" "You finally met someone who is not impressed by money." Before Ethan could answer, the front entrance opened again and a cold gust of rain drifted through the dining room. An elderly Japanese man entered slowly beneath the glow of the chandelier, removing dark leather gloves as the hostess greeted him. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and despite his age, he carried himself with remarkable posture. Claire noticed him immediately from across the room. For the first time all night, Ethan saw genuine surprise flicker across her face. Not fear. Recognition. The elderly man looked around the restaurant once before his eyes landed on Claire. He smiled instantly. "Bennett-san?" he said warmly in Japanese. Claire froze for half a heartbeat before walking toward him. "Takeda-sensei," she replied softly. Ethan straightened slightly in his chair. The honorific caught his attention immediately. "Sensei. Teacher." The old man laughed gently, clearly delighted. "I almost did not recognize you." Claire bowed politely, and Ethan noticed something startling. The bow was perfect, natural, not learned for politeness, learned through repetition, through years. Takeda spoke again in rapid Japanese, his voice warm and melodic. Claire answered effortlessly, her accent smooth and refined in a way Ethan suddenly realized he had never truly mastered himself. The conversation flowed between them like music. Marcus slowly lowered his fork. "Okay," he whispered. "Now this is getting interesting." Ethan barely heard him. He watched Claire carefully now, noticing how different she seemed speaking Japanese. Softer somehow. More grounded, like someone stepping briefly into a version of herself hidden beneath the restaurant uniform. Takeda gestured proudly toward her while speaking, and Claire laughed quietly before shaking her head modestly. Ethan caught fragments of the conversation. Kyoto, literature, translation, scholarship. Then Takeda suddenly turned his eyes toward Ethan and Marcus. Claire followed his gaze. For the first time all evening, Ethan looked strangely uncertain. Takeda smiled politely and asked Claire something in Japanese. She hesitated, just slightly. Then she answered in a softer voice than before. The old man's expression changed immediately. Surprise touched his face. He looked back at Ethan again, this time with visible curiosity. Claire tucked a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear and gently lowered her eyes for a moment as though trying to avoid attention. But it was already too late. The room had shifted again. Ethan could feel it. Whatever story Claire Bennett was hiding beneath that black waitress uniform was far bigger than he first imagined. The rain outside thickened into a silver curtain against the windows, while the warmth inside Whitmore Steakhouse grew quieter, heavier, almost expectant. Ethan Whitmore no longer touched his food. Across the dining room, Claire stood beside Takeda-sensei near the entrance. Speaking softly in Japanese, while the old man smiled with unmistakable affection. Ethan could not stop listening, not because he understood every word, but because for the first time in years he felt like the least intelligent person in the room. Takeda laughed warmly before saying something that made Claire lower her eyes with modest embarrassment. Ethan caught only part of the sentence. The youngest translator, followed by Kyoto University. Marcus slowly set his fork down. Did he just say university? Ethan remained silent. Takeda finally looked toward their table again and gestured politely. Claire hesitated for a moment before guiding the elderly man toward Ethan and Marcus. Her posture remained calm, but Ethan sensed reluctance beneath it, as though she preferred her past to remain invisible. Takeda stopped beside the table and bowed his head courteously. "Good evening," he said in careful English. "Forgive me. I was surprised to see Claire here tonight." Ethan stood automatically out of respect, something Marcus noticed immediately because Ethan almost never stood for anyone. "You know each other?" Takeda smiled. "Very well," Claire gently interrupted. "Takeda-sensei was one of my father's closest friends in Kyoto." The old man nodded proudly. "Her father was brilliant. But Claire—" He paused, looking at her with genuine admiration. Claire was exceptional. Claire looked slightly uncomfortable now. "Sensei—" "No," Takeda said kindly. "You always hide your accomplishments too much." Ethan folded his hands slowly in front of him. "What accomplishments?" Claire opened her mouth softly as if to redirect the conversation, but Takeda answered first. At 19 years old, she translated classical Japanese literature more accurately than graduate students twice her age. Marcus nearly choked on his drink. Ethan stared at Claire in disbelief. The quiet waitress standing beside their table suddenly felt impossible to place inside the simple version of reality he had created for her. Takeda continued gently. "Professors used to wait months for her translation notes." Claire shook her head lightly. "That was a long time ago. Talent does not disappear with time," Takeda replied. Ethan noticed the way Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the small leather order book in her hand. Not nervousness, more like discomfort from unwanted attention. Takeda looked toward Ethan again. "You work in international business, yes?" Ethan nodded carefully. "Technology investments. Then you understand how rare true cultural fluency is." Ethan glanced at Claire before answering. "Apparently not as well as I thought." For the first time all evening, Claire allowed herself the faintest smile. Small, brief, gone almost instantly, yet somehow it shifted the entire atmosphere around the table. Takeda reached into the pocket of his coat and removed an old folded paper with handwritten notes across it. "Actually," he said, adjusting his glasses, "I was reviewing a translation tonight before my train tomorrow morning. There is one phrase I still cannot decide between." Claire sighed softly the way someone sighs when an old teacher asks them a question they already know the answer to. Takeda handed her the paper. Ethan watched carefully as Claire scanned the handwritten Japanese characters beneath the chandelier light. Her eyes moved once across the page, then twice. Nothing dramatic changed in her expression. But when she answered, her voice carried a calm confidence Ethan had not heard before. She explained the phrase in Japanese first, then translated it into English with careful nuance, describing how one version sounded technically correct, while the other carried emotional sincerity rooted in old Kyoto dialects. Even Marcus sat frozen listening to her. Claire was not simply speaking another language. She was understanding emotion inside the language, culture inside silence, meaning inside implication. Takeda smiled proudly the moment she finished. "Exactly," he said softly. "You still hear the soul behind the words." Ethan looked down at the untouched bourbon glass near his hand. Earlier that night, he had laughed at her existence without even learning her name. Now every sentence coming from Claire made him feel smaller in ways money could not repair. And Claire never once tried to make him feel that way. That was the part he could not stop thinking about. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm after Takeda-sensei moved to his table near the front windows. But Ethan Whitmore could still feel the weight of the conversation lingering in the air around him. The jazz piano sounded softer now. The candlelight reflected against crystal glasses like blurred gold across the dark room. Somewhere near the bar, people laughed over expensive wine and business deals, completely unaware that Ethan's entire perception of the evening had quietly collapsed over the course of an hour. Claire resumed her work as if nothing unusual had happened. That was what fascinated him most. She carried plates, refilled water glasses, folded linen napkins with steady hands. There was no sign she had once impressed professors in Kyoto or translated literature at a level most executives could barely comprehend. No arrogance. No need to announce herself. Marcus leaned back in his chair with a grin. You realize this is the first time I have ever seen you speechless. Ethan barely reacted. His eyes followed Claire as she moved between tables beneath the warm chandelier light. Why is she here? Marcus shrugged. Maybe because life is complicated. Ethan shook his head slowly. Someone with her background does not just become a waitress. And someone with your money is not supposed to look this confused over a woman carrying mashed potatoes. Yet here we are. Ethan ignored the joke again, but Marcus was right. None of this fit together in his mind. Wealthy people loved visible success. Degrees framed on walls. Titles in email signatures. Luxury watches. Public achievements. Claire seemed to have walked away from all of it voluntarily. A few minutes later, she approached their table again carrying a fresh pot of tea for Marcus. Compliments of Takeda-sensei, she said softly. Marcus smiled warmly. Tell him thank you. Claire nodded politely and began pouring the tea into delicate porcelain cups. Ethan watched the steam rise between them before finally speaking. Why did you stop? Claire looked up slightly. Stop what? Translation. Academia. Whatever path you were clearly exceptional at. She finished pouring the tea before answering. My mother became sick. Her tone remained calm, but the room somehow felt quieter after the sentence. Ethan said nothing. Claire rested the teapot gently onto the table. After my father passed away, it was just the two of us. Marcus lowered his eyes respectfully while Ethan listened more carefully than he had listened to anyone in weeks. Claire continued softly. Medical bills became more important than research papers. Ethan glanced down briefly at the Swiss watch resting against his wrist. A watch that cost more than most families spent in months. Claire noticed the direction of his eyes for only an instant before continuing. So I came back to New York. And started working here? Ethan asked. Claire nodded once. The hours allowed me to take care of her. Ethan studied her expression carefully, expecting bitterness somewhere beneath the calm surface. He found none. That unsettled him again. You do not seem angry about it, he said quietly. Claire almost smiled. Angry at what? Giving all that up. She looked toward the rain beyond the windows before answering. Not everything valuable comes with status. The sentence landed harder than Ethan expected. Claire spoke the words gently, without accusation, yet somehow they cut deeper than criticism would have. Marcus slowly sipped his tea while watching Ethan absorb the moment in silence. Claire adjusted the sleeve near her silver bracelet again, exposing the engraved Japanese characters for only a second before the fabric covered them once more. Ethan noticed this time that the bracelet looked worn with age, like something passed down rather than purchased. Your father gave you that? He asked quietly. Claire touched the bracelet instinctively. Before he died. Her fingers rested against it for a moment longer than necessary. He said language matters because words are often the only bridges people leave behind. Ethan looked at her differently after that. Not as a waitress, not as an intellectual surprise, but as someone carrying an invisible history through a room full of strangers who never bothered to ask. Claire straightened slightly and returned to her professional calm. Can I bring you anything else tonight? Ethan opened his mouth, but for once in his life, no polished answer came immediately, because the truth embarrassed him. An hour ago he had laughed at her existence in another language. Now he found himself searching carefully for words simple enough not to sound foolish in front of her. Claire stepped away from the table after collecting the empty teacups, leaving Ethan staring at the reflection of rainwater trembling against the dark Manhattan windows. The city outside looked colder now, smaller somehow. Marcus loosened his tie and leaned back with an amused expression. "You know what the funniest part of tonight is?" Ethan remained quiet. "You walked in here thinking you were the smartest person in the building." Ethan finally looked over. "I never said that. You never had to." Marcus pointed lightly toward the dining room where Claire moved between tables beneath soft amber light. "And now a waitress has you questioning your entire worldview." Ethan almost argued, but he stopped himself because somewhere beneath Marcus's teasing was an uncomfortable truth. Claire Bennett had disrupted something inside him that money, status, and success had protected for years. He had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people eager to impress him. Investors, executives, consultants, everyone performed around wealth. But Claire did not perform. She simply existed with a quiet certainty that made everyone else seem louder than necessary. Before Ethan could respond, his phone vibrated sharply against the table. He glanced down at the screen. Hiro Tanaka. Ethan's jaw tightened instantly. Marcus noticed. "That sounds serious." Ethan answered the call immediately. "Hiro." The voice on the other end spoke rapidly in Japanese. Ethan's expression darkened with every sentence. "What do you mean the contract translation is inconsistent?" Marcus sat upright now. Ethan stood slowly from his chair and moved closer to the windows for privacy, while rain rolled behind him in silver streams. "No," Ethan said sharply in Japanese. "The acquisition clause was finalized yesterday." Hiro answered again, faster this time. Ethan rubbed his forehead. "How bad?" Pause followed. Then Ethan's face lost color. Marcus watched silently as Ethan lowered his eyes toward the floor. "A misunderstanding at this level could destroy the partnership," Ethan muttered. Across the restaurant, Claire glanced over briefly while carrying a tray of wine glasses. She immediately recognized the tension in Ethan's posture. People who spent years reading language often learned to read silence too. Ethan ended the call with a strained breath before returning to the table. "Problem?" Marcus asked carefully. Ethan sat down hard into the leather chair. "The Tokyo deal." "What happened?" Ethan looked furious with himself. "One of the translated clauses in the merger documents may carry the wrong implication in Japanese." Marcus frowned. "How does that even happen?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "Because language is not math." He reached into his briefcase beside the chair and pulled out several printed pages covered with notes, translations, and highlighted revisions. The papers landed heavily against the table. One phrase apparently sounds too aggressive in formal business Japanese. Marcus looked confused. "Aggressive?" The wording implies ownership instead of partnership. He rubbed his eyes tiredly. Hiro said their board interpreted it as disrespectful. Marcus whistled softly. "That is bad." Ethan stared down at the documents with frustration building behind his calm exterior. $1 billion negotiation balanced on nuance, on implication, on a single sentence translated incorrectly. And suddenly he remembered Claire's voice saying, "You still hear the soul behind the words." The realization hit him almost painfully. Ethan looked across the restaurant again. Claire was standing near the bar organizing clean glasses beneath warm hanging lights. Completely composed. Completely unaware that the man who mocked her existence an hour earlier was now thinking about asking for her help. Ethan hated how humbling that felt. Marcus followed his gaze and smirked slowly. "You were thinking about it too, huh?" Ethan remained silent. "Come on," Marcus said quietly. "You know she could probably spot the problem in 5 minutes." Ethan exhaled sharply. His pride resisted the idea instantly. Men like Ethan Whitmore built entire identities around never needing rescue from strangers, especially not from people they underestimated publicly. Yet somewhere deep down he already knew the truth. Claire Bennett understood the language better than anyone in his legal department. Better than the consultants he paid 6 figures every month. Better than him. Across the dining room, Claire looked up for a brief moment and met his eyes again. Calm. Steady. Impossible to intimidate. Ethan lowered his gaze toward the translation papers in front of him and realized something uncomfortable for the first time in years. Intelligence looked very different when it did not need attention. Claire returned to the table a few minutes later carrying a small black tray with the check folder balanced carefully in one hand. The restaurant had grown quieter as the night moved closer to midnight. Rain still tapped softly against the windows, but now the city lights beyond the glass looked blurred and distant, like Manhattan itself had softened around the edges. Ethan Whitmore sat with the translation documents spread across the white tablecloth in front of him. Legal notes, Japanese revisions, highlighted phrases circled in frustration. Claire noticed immediately. Her eyes moved across the papers for less than a second before she gently placed the check folder beside Marcus. "Whenever you are ready," she said softly. Ethan looked up at her. For the first time all evening, there was no arrogance left in his expression, only hesitation. That alone felt unfamiliar to him. "Claire." She paused politely. "Yes." Ethan glanced briefly at the papers again before speaking. "Would you look at something for me?" Marcus leaned back slowly, almost smiling to himself. Claire remained still for a moment, clearly surprised by the request. "I am not a lawyer," she said carefully. "Neither are the people charging me $600 an hour apparently," Ethan replied quietly. That earned the smallest hint of amusement in her eyes. Ethan slid one page gently toward her across the table. "The acquisition clause." Claire lowered her gaze toward the document. "You think the wording offended the Tokyo board?" "That is what I was told." Claire read silently beneath the warm chandelier light while Ethan watched her face more carefully than he had watched billion-dollar presentations. She moved through the Japanese text slowly, thoughtfully, one finger resting lightly against the edge of the paper. No performance. No attempt to sound impressive. Just concentration. After nearly a minute, Claire looked up. "This phrase here." She pointed softly toward a highlighted sentence. Ethan leaned closer instinctively. "What about it?" "Technically, the translation is correct." Ethan frowned slightly. "But?" Claire glanced toward the rain outside for half a second before answering. "It sounds emotionally cold." Marcus blinked. "Emotionally cold?" Claire nodded gently. In American business language, directness often sounds efficient. In traditional Japanese corporate culture, especially with older executives, direct ownership language can feel disrespectful if trust has not been established first. Ethan stared at her. She continued calmly. "The phrase implies control instead of collaboration." Ethan lowered his eyes back to the contract. Exactly what Hiro had warned him about. Claire reached for a pen from the edge of the table. "May I?" Ethan nodded immediately. She carefully rewrote one sentence in elegant Japanese characters across the margin beside the original clause. Her handwriting looked almost artistic beneath the restaurant lighting. Ethan watched silently as she finished. "This version softens the hierarchy," she explained. "It sounds more like mutual growth instead of acquisition." Marcus looked between them. "You figured that out in under 60 seconds. Claire placed the pen down gently. "Language usually tells you what people are afraid of." Ethan felt something strange settle in his chest then. Respect. Real respect. Not the transactional kind bought through success or influence. Something quieter. Deeper. He looked at the revised sentence again before speaking softly. "You may have just saved a billion-dollar deal." Claire shook her head once. "No. I only corrected a sentence. That sentence could cost me months." Claire met his eyes calmly. "Then maybe the problem was never the sentence." Ethan sat very still after that. Because deep down he knew she was right. The failed negotiation in Tokyo had not only been about language. It had been about ego. About walking into rooms believing intelligence belonged to power. Claire gently closed the contract folder and slid it back toward him. "People hear respect before they hear intention," she said quietly. The sentence landed harder than anything anyone had said to him in years. Marcus looked almost uncomfortable witnessing the moment because the shift happening at the table was impossible to ignore now. Earlier that night, Ethan had spoken about Claire like she was invisible. Now he listened to every word she said like it mattered. Claire straightened softly. Is there anything else you need? Ethan looked up at her beneath the warm amber lights reflecting against the rain-streaked windows. For once, he answered honestly. Probably more than I realized. The restaurant had nearly emptied by the time Ethan signed the check. Midnight drifted quietly over Manhattan, while rain continued sliding down the windows in soft silver lines. The jazz music had faded lower now, almost blending into the sound of distant traffic outside. Marcus stood near the entrance, buttoning his coat while exchanging a few final words with Takeda-sensei before leaving. But Ethan remained seated for another moment beneath the warm chandelier light, staring at the revised contract sentence Claire had written in the margin beside his original translation. The difference between the two versions looked almost invisible on paper. Yet somehow one sounded cold while the other sounded human. Ethan had spent years believing precision mattered more than warmth. Tonight challenged that belief in ways he could not ignore. Claire approached quietly to collect the signed receipt folder. "Thank you for coming in tonight," she said softly. Ethan looked up at her. "Actually, I should probably be thanking you." Claire gave a polite smile. "I only corrected a phrase. You did more than that." She lowered her eyes briefly, almost uncomfortable receiving praise. Ethan noticed that too. Most people chased recognition the way investors chased profit. Claire seemed happier avoiding attention altogether. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored coat and removed a dark business card embossed with silver lettering. Whitmore Global Ventures. Ethan placed it gently on the table between them. "I want to offer you something." Claire looked at the card but did not pick it up. Ethan continued carefully. "I work with international firms across Tokyo, Singapore, and New York. We hire consultants for cultural communication all the time." Claire remained silent. "Someone with your background should not be carrying dinner plates in a restaurant." The words left his mouth before he fully considered how they sounded. Claire finally looked at him again. Calmly, not offended, just thoughtful. "And what exactly should someone like me be doing?" Ethan paused. The question unsettled him because he realized how easily he still categorized worth through professional status. "I only mean your abilities deserve more recognition." Claire glanced toward the rain outside the windows. "Recognition is not always the same thing as respect." Ethan felt the sentence settle heavily between them. She spoke gently, but every quiet sentence from Claire seemed to expose something uncomfortable beneath his worldview. He tried again. "You could help companies avoid mistakes like tonight." Claire rested the check folder lightly against her chest. "Maybe. Then why stay here?" She looked around the restaurant for a moment. The empty wine glasses, the dim lighting, the older couple still sharing dessert near the far corner. "Because right now this job gives me enough time to take care of my mother." Ethan nodded slowly. Claire continued softly. "And because I learned something important in Kyoto." "What is that?" "People who tie their value to status eventually become frightened of losing both." Ethan looked down at the expensive watch against his wrist again. Suddenly it felt heavier than usual. Claire gently slid the business card back across the table toward him. "I appreciate the offer." Ethan frowned slightly. "You are turning it down?" "No," she almost smiled. "I am simply saying respect should come before opportunity." The sentence landed harder than anything else she had said all night, because Ethan realized she was not talking about the job offer. She was talking about the beginning of the evening, about the moment he laughed in another language while believing she was too insignificant to understand him. Claire never accused him directly. She never embarrassed him publicly. But somehow her grace made the lesson impossible to escape. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before quietly asking, "Did you know I was insulting you?" Claire answered honestly, "Yes." Shame moved quietly through him then. Not dramatic, not loud, just undeniable. "And you still helped me." Claire adjusted the sleeve over her silver bracelet once more. "My father used to say the easiest way to reveal character is to give people kindness after they least deserve it." Ethan lowered his eyes. For years he had negotiated with billionaires, politicians, and investors without feeling intimidated once. Yet standing in front of a calm waitress beneath soft restaurant lights somehow felt more humbling than any boardroom he had ever entered. Claire stepped back gently from the table. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore." Ethan watched her walk away through the quiet restaurant, while rain shimmered beyond the glass like fading city lights. And for the first time in a very long time, he realized money had never truly made him impressive. It had only made people quieter around him. 1 week later, the rain returned to Manhattan almost exactly the same way it had that night. Silver lines against dark windows. Taxi lights reflecting across wet pavement. The city moving too fast to notice quiet things. Inside Whitmore Steakhouse, the dinner crowd filled the room with low conversation and the soft sound of glasses touching beneath warm amber light. Claire Bennett adjusted the sleeve of her black uniform before carrying a tray of tea toward a corner table near the windows. The restaurant manager walked past her with a surprised expression. "Your regular is back." Claire looked up slightly. "My regular?" "The billionaire." Claire followed his gaze across the dining room and saw Ethan Whitmore seated alone at the same table near the rain-streaked glass. But something about him looked different tonight. Simpler somehow. No entourage. No loud business conversation. No expensive arrogance filling the room before he spoke. Even his charcoal coat rested folded beside him instead of draped over the chair like a status symbol. Claire approached calmly with a menu in hand. Ethan stood the moment she reached the table. Claire paused, slightly surprised. Wealthy men rarely stood for waitresses. Ethan noticed the flicker of surprise in her expression and gave a small, almost awkward smile. "Good evening, Claire." His voice sounded quieter than before, more careful. Claire returned the smile politely. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." Ethan glanced toward the chair across from him. "Would it be all right if I asked for your recommendation tonight?" Claire looked at him for a second longer than usual. Not because of the question, because she recognized something rare in powerful people. Humility. "The sea base is excellent tonight," she answered softly. "Then I will trust your judgment." She nodded once and collected the menu. Before she could step away, Ethan spoke again, this time in Japanese. Slow, deliberate, respectful. "Thank you for helping me last week." Claire blinked softly in surprise. The pronunciation was not perfect. The pacing was cautious. But that was exactly why it mattered. Ethan was no longer speaking Japanese to impress anyone in the room. He was speaking carefully because he finally understood language was not performance. It was consideration. Claire answered him in Japanese just as gently. "You are welcome." Ethan smiled faintly, almost embarrassed by his own accent now. "The Tokyo deal survived," he admitted in English. "They signed 3 days ago." Claire rested her hands lightly behind her back. "I am glad." Ethan looked out toward the rain for a moment before speaking again. "I used your revised sentence in the final meeting. And," he laughed quietly under his breath. One of the executives said it was the first time an American company sounded like they actually wanted partnership instead of control. Claire lowered her eyes modestly. Ethan studied her for another second before reaching into his coat pocket again. Claire noticed immediately and almost smiled before he even spoke. "It is not another job offer," Ethan said quickly. "I learned my lesson." This time he placed something much smaller on the table. A simple handwritten note folded neatly in half. Claire looked at him curiously. "What is this?" Ethan leaned back slightly. "An apology." Claire hesitated before opening the note carefully beneath the soft restaurant light. The handwriting was clean but unmistakably personal. Not written by an assistant. Not typed by an office employee. Just a few simple lines. "Thank you for showing me the difference between intelligence and wisdom. One tries to impress the room. The other tries to understand it." Claire stared quietly at the words for a moment before looking back up at him. Ethan held her gaze without hiding behind confidence this time. "You were right," he said softly. "Respect should come before opportunity." The rain continued sliding down the windows behind him, while the city lights shimmered beyond the glass like distant stars. Claire folded the note carefully and slipped it into the pocket beside her silver bracelet. Then, for the first time since the night they met, her smile reached her eyes completely. Warm, genuine, quiet. Ethan noticed immediately, and somehow that small smile felt more valuable than every deal he had closed that year. Claire picked up the menu gently. "I will put your order in now." Ethan nodded once before answering softly in Japanese again. "Please take your time." Claire walked away through the golden restaurant light while Ethan watched the reflection of Manhattan blur softly behind her. A week earlier he had entered the room believing power made people important. But now he understood something far rarer. The strongest people are often the ones who never need to announce their worth at all.